Out on the Montana plains, where the wind cuts like a razor and the sky is a sheet of cold iron, there lived a man named Francis Clay. They just called him Clay, and that's what he was. Hardened, unmoving, a man carved from the very rock and grief of the land. It was 1883, and winter had its teeth in everything. Smoke was the only thing that rose from the McGraw ranch, a lonely grey ribbon against a lonely grey sky. Clay was a wealthy man. Cattle, land, a barn as broad as his shoulders. But his soul was a frozen patch of ground. 3 years back, his wife, Lillian, had died, giving him two beautiful things he couldn't stand to look at for too long. Twin daughters, Clara and May. Their laughter was like sunshine on a grave. It warmed him, and it hurt him all at once. He was a fortress built around an empty room. And into that fortress a woman walked. Her name was Maria Dawson. She came up the long, frozen path in worn-out shoes, a thin shawl wrapped around her like a prayer. The wind bit right through it, but she didn't flinch. She was like a willow in a storm, bent but not broken. Life had done its best to snap her in two. Her husband went to war and became a ghost. A fever had stolen her chance at children, making her an outcast in a world where a woman was measured by her sons. She was homeless, kinless, with nothing left but a quiet desperation. She'd heard the McGraw ranch might have work for a pair of hands that didn't ask for much. Clay met her on the porch, his shadow falling over her like a sentence. His eyes were flint grey, and they saw everything, the worn shawl, the tired lines on her face, and softened for none of it. The little girls, Clara and May, toddled out and clutched at her skirt like she was an old friend. Like they knew something he didn't. But Clay's voice came out low and rough. "You ain't worth much," he said, each word a hammer blow. "You're here to cook for my girls. Don't expect more." The words should have frozen her solid, but she just bowed her head. She accepted it. What other choice did she have? "Then I'll cook," she whispered. But as she stepped inside, one of the girls, little Clara, pointed a tiny mittened hand at a thin silver chain around Maria's neck, half hidden by her shawl. A small, intricately carved locket glinted in the cold light. Clay's breath caught in his throat. He froze, his eyes locked on that piece of silver. He knew that locket. It had been his wife's. It was supposed to be buried with her. Clay's mind reeled. Thief. That was the first word that crashed through his thoughts. This woman, this stray, was a ghoul who robbed graves. He wanted to grab her, to rip the locket from her neck, and throw her back into the snow she'd crawled out of. But his girls were there, looking up at Maria with wide, innocent eyes, and he couldn't unleash the storm inside him. Not in front of them. He just stared, his jaw clenched so tight a tooth ached. Maria saw the look in his eyes. She saw the recognition, the fury. She instinctively covered the locket with her hand, her face paling. She hadn't wanted him to see it. Not yet. Not like this. "Get inside," Clay growled, his voice a low thunder. "The girls need their supper." He turned and stalked away toward the barn, needing to put distance between himself and the woman who wore his dead wife's memory around her neck. He needed the biting cold to clear his head. He worked for hours, splitting logs with a savage force, each swing of the axe a blow against the questions tormenting him. How did she get it? Who was she? Was this some cruel trick? Inside the house, a different kind of warmth was spreading. Maria, despite the cold welcome, moved with a quiet purpose. She coaxed a fire to life in the hearth, her hands deft and sure. She found the kitchen, a cold and neglected space, and began to transform it. The smell of baking bread soon filled the silent rooms, a scent the house hadn't known in 3 long years. The twins followed her like shadows, their earlier laughter replaced by a watchful curiosity. They sat at the big wooden table, watching her knead the dough, their little chins resting on their hands. She sang softly as she worked, a simple hymn that felt older than the hills. The melody wrapped around the cold corners of the house and seemed to sand down the sharp edges of its sorrow. Clay eventually came back inside, the rage cooled to a hard, simmering suspicion. He stopped in the doorway, unseen. He saw his daughters sitting peacefully. He smelled the bread. He heard the song. For a moment, just a fleeting second, the house felt like a home again. And he hated it. He hated her for bringing it back to life, for disturbing the sacred silence of his grief. That night, after the girls were asleep, tucked into beds that smelled faintly of lavender from a sachet Maria had placed on their pillows, Clay confronted her. The locket was gone, tucked away beneath her dress, but he could still see its ghost. They stood in the dim parlor, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace. "Where did you get it?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "The locket." Maria didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a sorrow that matched his. "It was a gift," she said softly, "from a friend." "Lillian didn't have friends out here," he shot back. "She had me, she had this ranch, and she's dead." "She wasn't always out here," Maria replied, her voice steady. "Before she was Lillian McGraw, she was Lillian Carter. We grew up together back in Ohio. We were like sisters." She reached into a small cloth bundle, her only possession in the world, and pulled out a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She held them out to him. "She wrote to me. Almost every week. She told me about you, about the ranch, about the girls." Clay stared at the letters, at the familiar, elegant script on the envelopes. It was Lillian's hand. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This woman wasn't a stranger. She was a piece of his wife's past, a past he knew almost nothing about. "She made me promise," Maria's voice trembled slightly. She had a fear, a feeling. "She said if anything ever happened to her, I was to come for the girls. She said they would need someone who carried a piece of her with them." She touched her chest, right where the locket lay hidden. "She sent this to me a month before they were born, as a reminder of that promise." Clay didn't take the letters. He couldn't. To touch them would be to admit this was real. He just stood there, the fortress of his certainty crumbling around him, leaving him exposed and raw in the firelight. He had hired a cook, a stray, but he had let a ghost into his house, a ghost with a promise to keep. Clay didn't sleep that night. He sat in his cold room, the echo of Maria's words ringing in his ears. Lillian had a secret friend, a secret promise. What else hadn't she told him? He felt a new kind of grief, one laced with betrayal. He had thought he knew everything about his wife, that their life on the ranch was their entire world. Now he felt like a stranger to his own past. The next morning, a fragile truce settled over the house. Clay didn't speak of the locket again, and Maria kept it hidden. But something had changed. The air was thick with unspoken things. Clay watched her constantly, his gaze heavy and searching. He watched her gentle hands braid his daughter's hair. He watched her mend their clothes with tiny, perfect stitches. He saw the way Clara and May blossomed under her care, their laughter losing its fragile, lonely edge. He saw all this, and the ice around his heart began to crack, just a little. But if a thaw was beginning inside the McGraw ranch, a deep freeze was setting in outside of it. The town did not welcome Maria. When she went to the mercantile for supplies, whispers followed her like a cold draft. They saw a desperate widow and a rich, grieving rancher. They saw an opportunity. The whispers were led by one voice in particular, a woman named Beatrice Hemlock. She was the town's self-appointed queen bee, a woman with a sharp tongue and eyes that missed nothing. She had set her own cap for Francis Clay after Lillian died, and she saw Maria not as a cook, but as a rival. "Mark my words," Beatrice would say to the other women, her voice just loud enough for Maria to hear. "That one's a snake. She'll worm her way in, and before he knows it, she'll have his name and his land." Maria would walk by with her head held high, the words stinging like sleet. She carried the town's scorn back to the ranch with her, a heavy burden on top of all the others. Clay heard the gossip, too. Men in the saloon would nudge each other when he walked in. "Heard you got yourself some help," they'd snicker. Clay's fists would clench, but he'd say nothing. He told himself he didn't care what they thought, but a slow, burning shame began to coil in his gut. Shame for their cruelty, and shame for his own, for the first words he'd ever spoken to her. The breaking point came during a sudden violent blizzard. The world outside the ranch house disappeared behind a wall of swirling white. For days they were trapped, the three of them and this quiet woman who was still a stranger. Supplies ran low, the woodpile dwindled. One afternoon Clay looked out the window and saw Maria fighting her way through the gale-force wind. her skirts whipping around her, an armful of firewood clutched to her chest. She hadn't been asked. She just saw a need and met it, battling the storm as if the ranch were her own. That evening, her hands were raw and cracked, bleeding in places. She said nothing, hiding them in her lap. But Clay saw. The next morning, a pair of his old leather work gloves lay on the kitchen table. They were stiff and much too large for her, but the seams had been mended with his own rough stitches. Maria found them as the sun rose. She picked them up, felt the warmth still in them, and pressed them to her chest. A single tear slid down her cheek, a drop of warmth in the cold, silent kitchen. The storm broke, both outside and in, but the peace was short-lived. That very evening, as they sat for supper, little May, who was usually the quiet one, looked at Maria with her serious, dark eyes. "You smell nice," she said, her small voice clear as a bell in the quiet room. "Like Mama." Clay froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Maria's breath hitched. "What do you mean, sweet girl?" she asked gently. "The flowers," May said, pointing to the lavender sachet on the mantel that Maria had made. Mama always had flowers, but she didn't like the bitter tea the lady brought. A chill, colder than any winter wind, shot down Clay's spine. He remembered. In the last weeks of her pregnancy, Lillian had been weak. Beatrice Hemlock had started visiting, bringing herbal tonics and teas, insisting they would give Lillian strength. Clay had thought it was kindness, but Lillian had complained. She'd said the tea tasted bitter. She'd said she felt weaker after Beatrice left. He had dismissed it as the anxieties of a difficult pregnancy. Now his daughter's innocent words painted a sickening picture. What if the town's gossip wasn't just malice? What if it was a smokescreen? What if Beatrice wasn't trying to get Clay for herself, but trying to cover something up? Something terrible. He looked at Maria, and for the first time, he didn't see a reminder of his loss. He saw an ally. He had to know the truth. That night, he tore the house apart. He started in his and Lillian's old bedroom, a room he'd barely entered in 3 years. The air was stale with dust and memory. He searched through her drawers, her wardrobe, looking for something, anything. He didn't even know what he was looking for. A letter, a diary, a clue that would make sense of his daughter's words and the cold dread that was now creeping into his soul. He found it at the bottom of an old hope chest tucked beneath her wedding dress. It was a small leather-bound journal. His hands trembled as he opened it. The first pages were filled with Lillian's beautiful, familiar script, full of hopes for the baby, love for him, dreams for their life on the ranch. But as he turned the pages, the tone began to change. The entries grew shorter, the handwriting shakier. She wrote about Beatrice's visits. "Beatrice came again today. She insists I drink her tonic. She says it's for the baby's health, but it tastes so bitter, it makes me dizzy." He kept reading, his heart pounding against his ribs. The entries grew more fearful. "I feel so weak after she leaves. I told Francis, but he thinks I'm being fanciful. Beatrice says a good wife doesn't complain." She smiled when she said it, but her eyes were cold. Then came the last entry, written just 2 days before the twins were born, the handwriting barely a scrawl. "She knows I'm getting weaker. Today she said if I wasn't strong enough to give Francis a son, he'd need a new wife soon enough. A stronger wife." She looked at my belly when she said it. "I'm scared. I told Maria in my letter. I told her to come if—" The entry ended there. The page was blotted, as if a tear had fallen. Clay slammed the journal shut. The air was knocked from his lungs. It wasn't just grief that had taken his wife. It was poison. It was malice. It was Beatrice Hemlock. The shame he'd felt before was nothing compared to the guilt that now washed over him. He hadn't listened. He hadn't protected her. He had let a viper into his home, and she had stolen the life of his wife. The rage that followed was a white-hot fire. He wanted to ride into town, drag Beatrice from her house, and make her pay for what she'd done. But he stopped. He had no proof but a dead woman's journal and a child's fragmented memory. They would call him a madman, crazed with grief. Beatrice would twist it, paint him as unhinged, and use it to turn the whole town against him. And what about Maria? She was already an outcast. If he made this accusation, Beatrice would destroy her, claim Maria had put these ideas in his head, that she'd forged the journal to get rid of her rival. He was trapped. He held the horrible truth in his hands, and he could do nothing with it. He went downstairs. The house was dark and silent, save for the whisper of the wind outside. Maria was sitting by the hearth, mending one of the girl's dresses by the faint light of the embers. She looked up as he entered, her eyes questioning. He didn't have to say a word. She saw the devastation on his face. He sank into the chair opposite her, the journal held loosely in his hand. "You were right," he said, his voice raspy. She was scared. He opened the journal and began to read aloud. He read about the bitter tea, the cold smiles, the veiled threats. He read Lillian's final desperate words. When he finished, the only sound was the crackle of the dying fire. Maria's face was a mask of sorrow. Tears traced paths through the soot on her cheeks. "I knew she was afraid of something," she whispered. "Her letters. They changed." She stopped talking about the future. "I did nothing," Clay said, his voice breaking. "She tried to tell me, and I didn't listen." "You were a husband, not a mind reader," Maria said, her voice firm, cutting through his guilt. "You couldn't have known, but now we do." Her strength was a shock. He had expected tears, fear, but her eyes held a fierce light. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was hers too. It was for Lillian. Over the next few days, a strange alliance formed between them. They were co-conspirators, bound by a shared secret and a thirst for justice. The cold distance between them evaporated, replaced by a focused intensity. They spoke in low voices after the girls were asleep, piecing together the timeline, rereading the letters and the journal, searching for a piece of concrete evidence, something Beatrice couldn't deny. But Beatrice sensed the shift. She must have seen the new closeness between Clay and Maria, seen the purpose in Clay's eyes. She knew her time was running out. She decided to strike first. One morning, Maria went into town for flour. Beatrice was waiting for her outside the mercantile. She cornered her between the building and a water trough, her face twisted with a venomous smile. "You think you've won, don't you?" Beatrice hissed, her voice low. "You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" "I've taken nothing," Maria said, her own voice steady, though her heart was hammering. "You've taken him," Beatrice spat, "but he'll see you for what you are, a barren little stray. And those girls, it would be a shame if something happened to them. Accidents happen all the time on a ranch. A fall, a fire. They need a mother to protect them. And you are not their mother." The threat hung in the air, clear and cold. It was no longer about gossip or social standing. This was a direct warning. Beatrice would hurt the children to get to Clay. Maria felt a terror so profound it almost buckled her knees. She could endure the whispers, the scorn, even the threats against herself. But the girls, she would die before she let anyone harm them. She turned and fled, not even buying the flour. She ran all the way back to the ranch, Beatrice's threat echoing in her ears. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't be the reason Clara and May were in danger. She had to leave. For their sake, she had to disappear. When she got back to the ranch, her mind was made up. She moved like a phantom, her hands shaking as she gathered her few belongings into her small cloth bundle. Every sound made her jump, the creak of a floorboard, the sigh of the wind. She kept seeing Beatrice's cold eyes, hearing her chilling words. Accidents happen. She wrote a short, simple note for Clay, leaving out the threat. She just said the town was too cruel, that her presence was bringing shame to his family, and she couldn't bear it any longer. She told him he had Lillian's letters and journal, and that she prayed he would find justice for his wife. She kissed the sleeping foreheads of Clara and May, her tears falling onto their cheeks. This was the hardest thing she had ever done, walking away from the only home she'd ever known, from the little girls she had grown to love as her own. She was halfway across the yard, the cold dawn light just beginning to break, when a small voice called out, "Maria!" It was Clara, standing on the porch, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. May was right behind her. When they saw the bundle in Maria's hand, their faces crumpled. They understood. She was leaving. A wail of pure, heartbroken despair ripped through the morning quiet. It was a sound that could tear the sky in two. They ran to her, screaming, clinging to her skirts, their small bodies trembling with terror and grief. "Don't go! Don't go!" Maria dropped to her knees, pulling them into a desperate embrace, her own resolve shattering into a million pieces. "I have to, my sweet girls, I have to," she sobbed, whispering apologies that made no sense. The ranch house door burst open. Clay stood there, his face a thundercloud. He had heard the screams, and his first thought was that Beatrice had made good on her threat. Seeing Maria with her bundle, surrounded by his weeping children, the pieces clicked into place. "What in hell are you doing?" he roared, his voice raw with fear and fury. Maria struggled to her feet. "It's better this way," she said, her voice broken. "She threatened them, Francis. Beatrice. She's going to hurt them because of me. I cannot let that happen." The truth hit Clay like a physical blow. He had been so focused on finding justice for the dead, he had forgotten to protect the living. He saw it all in that one terrible moment. Maria's sacrifice, his daughter's terror, his own failure. He saw them clinging not to a servant, but to the very heart of their world. He saw his own crushing loneliness mirrored in her tear-filled eyes. The fortress he had built around himself didn't just crack, it exploded. He crossed the yard in 3 long strides. His voice, when it came again, was not a roar, but a raw, trembling plea. "Don't leave us." The words hung in the frozen air. Maria stared at him, her breath catching. "Don't leave me," he said, the words torn from a place deep inside him he thought had died with Lillian. He reached out, his calloused hands hovering near hers. "I was a fool," he said, his voice thick with 3 years of unshed tears. "A blind, arrogant fool. I told you that you weren't worth much. God help me, I was wrong. You are worth everything. You gave my girls back their laughter. You gave this house back its soul. You gave me hope." He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. This was it. The final truth. "Stay," he said, "not as a cook, not as a shadow. Stay as my equal. Stay as my wife." The proposal was so unexpected, so impossible, it stunned the world into silence. The wind dropped. The girls stopped crying, their wide eyes moving from his face to hers. Maria's lips parted, a gasp of disbelief escaping. This man who had looked at her with such contempt was now looking at her with a reverence she had never seen from anyone. "Say yes," Clara whispered, tugging on her sleeve. Maria looked from the children's hopeful faces to Clay's desperate, open one. She saw the truth there. This wasn't a bargain. It wasn't about protection. It was a plea from a broken man who had finally found the one person who could make him whole. Her bundle slipped from her fingers, falling unnoticed into the snow. She lifted her chin, her voice soft but strong as steel. "If you mean those words, Francis Clay," she said, "then yes." A slow smile spread across Clay's face, the first real smile he'd worn in years. It transformed his harsh features, making him look like the man Lillian must have fallen in love with. He scooped up his daughters, one in each arm, and they buried their happy faces in his shoulders. He looked at Maria over their heads, a silent promise passing between them. The fight wasn't over, but now they would face it together, as a family. Clay didn't waste a moment. He left the girls with Maria, saddled his fastest horse, and rode into town like a storm front. He didn't go to the sheriff. This wasn't a matter for the law, not yet. This was a matter for the court of public opinion. He found Beatrice Hemlock exactly where he knew she'd be, holding court on the steps of the Mercantile, spreading her daily dose of poison. The usual circle of gossips was gathered around her. "I heard the stray finally tucked tail and ran," Beatrice was saying with a smug laugh. "Told you he'd come to his senses." "You're wrong, Beatrice," Clay's voice boomed as he dismounted. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. He walked right up to her, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. He was holding Lillian's journal. Beatrice's smile faltered. A flicker of fear crossed her face. "Francis," she said, trying to sound pleasant. "What a surprise." "No more surprises," Clay said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And no more lies." He opened the journal. "You all know my wife, Lillian, passed in childbirth," he said, his voice carrying across the silent street. "That's what I thought too. That's the story we all believed." He looked directly at Beatrice. "But some of us knew it wasn't the truth, didn't we, Beatrice? Some of us knew about the tonics you brought her, the bitter tea that was supposed to make her strong. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Beatrice's face went white. That's, that's a lie. He's gone mad with grief, she stammered. Am I? Clay asked. He read from the journal. He read Lillian's words of fear, her description of the dizziness, her account of Beatrice's chilling threat about him needing a stronger wife. He read every damning word, his voice ringing with the pain and fury of a man betrayed. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Everyone stared at Beatrice, their faces a mixture of shock and horror. The women who had been her friends just moments before now took a step back, as if she were carrying a plague. And this morning, Clay continued, his voice dropping to a deadly growl, she threatened my children. She threatened to harm my daughters if the woman I love didn't leave town. He pointed a trembling finger at her. This woman is not just a gossip. She is a poisoner, a monster who hides behind a pious face. Beatrice tried to speak, to defend herself, but no words came out. She was trapped in the web of her own deceit, exposed and condemned in the eyes of the entire town. They looked at her now and saw not the respectable town leader, but a jealous, cruel woman capable of murder. The sheriff, drawn by the commotion, pushed through the crowd. He didn't need any more convincing. The look on Beatrice's face was a confession in itself. Justice, swift and final, had come to the Montana plains. The wedding was a quiet affair, held in the same small church where Lillian had been mourned. The whole town came, not out of morbid curiosity this time, but out of a profound respect. They came to witness not the union of a rich rancher and a poor widow, but the forging of a family that had walked through fire and come out stronger. Clay stood at the altar, his daughters holding his hands. When Maria walked down the aisle, her simple dress seeming to glow in the afternoon light, a genuine, heartfelt warmth filled the room. Clay's vows were not flowery or poetic. They were simple, strong, and true. He spoke not of ownership, but of partnership. Not of duty, but of devotion. When it was Maria's turn, her voice was clear and steady. She looked into his eyes and promised him not just her love, but her strength, her loyalty, her unwavering faith. When the pastor pronounced them man and wife, Clara and May tossed dried flower petals into the air, their laughter echoing through the rafters, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. That night, the McGraw ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was a peaceful silence, filled with the soft breathing of sleeping children and the gentle crackle of a warm fire. Clay and Maria sat by the hearth, their hands intertwined. "You saved me, Maria," he said, his voice soft. "You saved all of us." She leaned her head on his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt comforting against her cheek. "We survived," she whispered, repeating the words she had once spoken into the darkness, "because we keep loving." And in that moment, they both knew it was true. The long, brutal winter was finally over. The snow would melt, the plains would turn green, and a new season of life had begun. They had found more than just love. They had found justice, redemption, and a peace deeper than any valley. They had taken a world of sorrow and silence and built a home. What do you think? Can a person's greatest wound also be the source of their greatest strength? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of love and justice on the frontier, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more tales that prove the human spirit can endure any storm.